Charles said, "The crown is on my head." Traoré replied, "Then I'll knock it off." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty courtyard of the village school in Bamako, Mali. Charles Dubois adjusted his crisp white shirt and straightened his tie, preparing for another day as the regional education supervisor. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Born in Lyon to a family of colonial administrators, Charles had spent the last 15 years in French West Africa, climbing the ranks of the educational bureaucracy with the same methodical precision his father had used to govern entire districts. He stepped out of his modest but well-appointed quarters, nodding to the local staff who swept the grounds. They responded with the practiced deference he had come to expect, their eyes cast downward as they murmured their morning greetings in broken French. Charles had learned enough Bambara to give basic instructions, but he preferred French. It was, after all, the language of civilization, the language that would lift these people from their traditional ways into the modern world. The year was 1958, and change was stirring across Africa like dust kicked up by an approaching storm. Charles felt it in the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, in the way younger teachers looked at him with something that wasn't quite respect anymore. But he pushed these observations aside. France had been good to Africa, he reasoned. They had built schools, hospitals, roads. They had brought order to chaos, education to ignorance. In the teacher's lounge, Charles reviewed the morning's agenda over his usual cup of coffee, imported from France naturally. The local brew was too bitter for his refined palate. He was particularly looking forward to observing the mathematics class taught by one of the newer instructors, a young man who had recently returned from teacher training in Dakar. The report suggested he was quite promising, though perhaps a bit too eager to incorporate local examples into his lessons. As Charles walked toward the mathematics classroom, he could hear the animated discussion spilling through the open windows. The voice leading the conversation was confident, passionate, speaking in rapid-fire French punctuated with phrases in Bambara that drew enthusiastic responses from the students. Charles frowned. This mixing of languages was exactly the sort of undisciplined approach he had been working to eliminate. He paused outside the door, observing through the window before making his presence known. The teacher was tall and lean, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught in any colonial training program. He moved around the classroom with fluid grace, engaging each student personally, making complex mathematical concepts accessible through examples drawn from their daily lives, calculating the fair price for millet in the market, determining the optimal planting density for sorghum fields. What struck Charles most was the way the students responded. These were the same children who sat like stone statues in other classes, mechanically repeating French conjugations and European historical dates. Here they leaned forward, raised their hands eagerly, debated solutions with the kind of intellectual passion Charles had only seen in the finest schools in France. The teacher noticed Charles at the window and nodded respectfully, but there was something in his eyes, a directness that bordered on challenge. He continued his lesson without missing a beat, but Charles could sense a subtle shift in the room's energy. As you can see, the teacher was saying in perfect French, mathematics is not a foreign concept imposed upon us. Our ancestors built the great libraries of Timbuktu, developed sophisticated astronomical calculations, created architectural marvels that still stand today. We are not empty vessels waiting to be filled with European knowledge. We are inheritors of our own rich intellectual tradition. Charles felt his jaw tighten. This was exactly the sort of dangerous romanticism that threatened the careful order they had built. Yes, Africa had its history, but that was the past. The future lay in embracing European methods, European values, European progress. After the class ended and the students filed out, chattering excitedly about the lesson, Charles entered the room. The teacher was erasing the blackboard, his movements economical and precise. "Monsieur Traoré, I presume," Charles said, consulting his notes. The young man turned, offering a slight bow of acknowledgement. "Amadou Traoré, yes, sir. I hope you found the lesson satisfactory." There was nothing overtly disrespectful in his tone, But Charles detected an undercurrent of something, not quite defiance, but certainly not the eager-to-please deference he was accustomed to. "Your teaching methods are unconventional," Charles said, choosing his words carefully. "I noticed you incorporated a great deal of local content into what should be a straightforward mathematics lesson." Traoré's expression remained neutral, but his dark eyes seemed to intensify. "I find that students learn better when they can connect new concepts to their existing knowledge and experience, sir. The mathematical principles remain the same, but the context makes them more accessible." "Context," Charles repeated slowly. "Yes, well, we must be careful not to reinforce backward thinking in the name of accessibility. These children need to prepare for the modern world, not cling to traditional ways that will hold them back." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with unspoken tensions and fundamentally different worldviews. Finally, Traoré spoke. "With respect, sir, I believe we may have different definitions of what constitutes progress." Charles studied the younger man's face, noting the intelligence there, the quiet dignity, the complete absence of the submissive gratitude he expected from local teachers who had benefited from French education and training. "Perhaps," Charles said finally, "but in this school, in this system, there's only one definition that matters. The French definition. The correct definition." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "I'll be observing your classes more frequently, Monsieur Traoré. I want to ensure that our students are receiving the proper preparation for their examinations." As Charles walked back to his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in that brief encounter. Traoré had shown him respect, followed protocol, said nothing that could be considered insubordinate. Yet Charles felt as though he had been challenged in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The afternoon brought a stack of administrative reports and correspondence from the Colonial Education Ministry in Dakar. As Charles worked through the papers, he found his thoughts returning to the mathematics classroom, to the engaged faces of the students, to the quiet confidence in Traoré's voice when he spoke of African intellectual traditions. Perhaps it was time to establish more clearly who held authority in this school and what vision of progress would guide these young minds toward their future. The weekly staff meeting convened in the school's main conference room, a sparse space dominated by a long wooden table and portraits of French officials staring down from the walls. Charles sat at the head of the table, his posture erect, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the assembled teachers. Most were older African men who had been teaching in the colonial system for decades, their faces weathered by years of navigating between two worlds. A few were younger French administrators like himself, sent from Paris to ensure proper standards were maintained. Amadou Traoré sat halfway down the table, his notebook open, pen poised to take notes. He had been punctual, professionally dressed, and courteous in every interaction since their first encounter 3 weeks ago. Yet Charles remained unsettled by something he couldn't name, a quality in the young teacher that seemed to fill more space than his physical presence warranted. "Before we discuss curriculum updates," Charles began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had perfected over years of colonial administration, "I want to address some concerns about teaching methods. It has come to my attention that certain instructors are introducing local perspectives into subjects that require adherence to established French academic standards." The room grew still. Several of the older teachers exchanged glances, their expressions carefully blank. The French administrators nodded approvingly. Traoré continued writing in his notebook, his face revealing nothing. Mathematics, science, history. These subjects have universal truths that must be taught according to proven European methods. Charles continued. "When we deviate from these standards, we do a disservice to our students. We prepare them inadequately for their examinations and for their roles in modern society." An older teacher, Monsieur Keita, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Supervisor Dubois, we have all found that students respond well when lessons connect to their daily experiences. Surely this doesn't compromise academic rigor." Charles felt his irritation spike. These men never seem to understand the bigger picture. "What concerns me, Monsieur Keita, is the tendency to romanticize traditional methods and perspectives. Our role is to guide these young people toward progress, not to reinforce outdated ways of thinking that will limit their potential. But, surely, Traoré's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. Education should build upon what students already know, rather than asking them to forget everything they've learned from their families and communities. All eyes turned to the young teacher. Charles felt a familiar tightening in his chest. That sense of being challenged in a way that was technically respectful, but fundamentally subversive. "Monsieur Traoré," Charles said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Are you suggesting that traditional African methods are equivalent to modern European educational approaches?" Traoré set down his pen and looked directly at Charles. "I'm suggesting that knowledge isn't the exclusive property of any single culture, sir. When we teach children that everything valuable comes from Europe, we teach them to despise their own heritage, their own capabilities." The silence that followed was deafening. Several teachers shifted uncomfortably. The French administrators looked shocked. Charles felt heat rising in his face. "That is quite enough," Charles said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable warning. "This kind of thinking is exactly what holds back progress in Africa. The reason we have schools, hospitals, roads, modern government, all of this exists because of French civilization. Without European guidance, this continent would still be mired in tribal conflicts and primitive superstitions." Traoré's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "With respect, Supervisor Dubois, I believe Africa's problems began when Europeans decided we needed their guidance to solve problems we didn't have before they arrived." The room erupted. Several teachers gasped audibly. The French administrators began speaking at once, their voices raised in outrage. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That will be quite enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Monsieur Traoré, you will remain after this meeting. The rest of you are dismissed." As the other teachers filed out, some casting worried glances back at Traoré, Charles remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. When the room was empty except for the two of them, he slowly sat back down, his eyes never leaving the young teacher's face. 15 years, Charles said finally. "I have spent 15 years in Africa, working to build something better for people like you. I have dedicated my career to creating opportunities that would never have existed without French investment, French expertise, French vision." Traoré nodded respectfully. "I don't question your dedication, sir, but I do question whether the opportunities you describe are truly opportunities if they require us to deny our own worth, our own intelligence, our own history." Charles leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Do you know what Africa was like before we came? Do you have any idea of the chaos, the violence, the sheer waste of human potential? Do you know what Africa was like before you came?" Traoré replied, his voice equally quiet but carrying a steel Charles had never heard before. "Do you know about the universities of Timbuktu when Paris was still a muddy village? Do you know about the mathematical innovations that came from this continent, the architectural achievements, the complex political systems that governed vast territories?" Charles felt something shift inside him, a fundamental challenge to everything he had built his identity upon. Those were isolated exceptions, romanticized myths that ignore the broader reality of African society. "No, sir," Traoré said, standing slowly. "They were the rule, not the exception, and they were systematically destroyed by people who needed to believe Africans were inferior in order to justify taking everything we had." The two men faced each other across the conference table, the weight of history and conflicting worldviews hanging between them like a physical presence. "You forget yourself, young man," Charles said, his voice shaking slightly with barely controlled anger. "You forget who provides your salary, who built this school, who created the very position that allows you to stand here and lecture me about African achievements." Traoré picked up his notebook and tucked it under his arm. "I forget nothing. Supervisor Dubois, I remember everything. That's exactly the problem." As he walked toward the door, Charles called after him. "Monsieur Traoré, I want to be very clear about something. I am the authority in this school. My word is law. My vision of education is the only vision that matters here." Traoré paused at the doorway and turned back, his expression calm but his eyes burning with quiet intensity. Your authority exists only as long as we choose to recognize it, sir, and that recognition is no longer guaranteed. The door closed, behind him with a soft click, leaving Charles alone in the conference room with the portraits of French officials staring down at him from the walls. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning with the weekly mail delivery from Dakar. Charles recognized the official seal immediately, the Ministry of Colonial Education, French West Africa. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal, though whether from anticipation or dread he couldn't say. The content was brief and devastating. Due to political developments and changing educational priorities, his position as regional education supervisor was being restructured. He was being reassigned to a smaller district school in rural Senegal, effective in 6 weeks. The letter was signed by officials he had considered allies, men who had praised his dedication to maintaining French educational standards in difficult circumstances. Charles read the letter 3 times before its implications fully sank in. This wasn't just a transfer, it was a demotion, a clear signal that his approach to colonial education was no longer valued by the administrators in Dakar. Worse still, the letter mentioned that local teachers would be given increased autonomy in curriculum development, and that cultural sensitivity would be prioritized in future educational policies. He set the letter down on his desk and stared out the window at the school courtyard. Students were beginning to arrive for morning classes, their voices carrying across the dusty ground in a mixture of French and local languages. For 15 years he had worked to create order from what he saw as chaos. Now that order was crumbling, and he couldn't understand why the colonial administration would abandon methods that had worked for generations. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Monsieur Keita, the senior African teacher, stood in the doorway with a concerned expression. "Supervisor Dubois, may I have a word?" Charles gestured to a chair, grateful for any distraction from his dark thoughts. Keita had always been reliable, respectful, one of the teachers Charles trusted to maintain proper standards even when he wasn't watching. "I wanted to speak with you about young Traoré," Keita began carefully. "The other teachers are concerned about the tension between you two. It's affecting the entire school." Charles felt his jaw tighten. Monsieur Traoré's attitudes are exactly the problem with education in Africa today. He seems to believe that traditional ways are equivalent to proven European methods. Keita was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, may I speak candidly?" "Of course. Amadou is not trying to undermine you or the school. He's trying to find a way to honor both worlds, the education he received in Dakar and the wisdom he learned from his grandfather. Many of us struggle with this same balance." Charles studied the older man's weathered face. Keita had been teaching for 25 years, had never caused problems, had always followed directives without question. Now even he seemed to be questioning the system Charles represented. "But surely you understand," Charles said, "that progress requires leaving behind outdated methods? We can't move forward while clinging to the past." "With respect, sir," Keita replied. "What if the past contains wisdom we need for the future? What if throwing away everything African means throwing away solutions to problems we haven't even recognized yet?" Before Charles could respond, voices erupted from the courtyard below. He looked out to see a crowd of students gathered around someone speaking passionately in Bambara. Charles couldn't make out the words, but the energy was unmistakable. Excitement, anger, hope all mixed together. "What's happening out there?" Charles demanded. Keita moved to the window and listened for a moment. His expression grew troubled. "They're discussing the news from Guinea. Sékou Touré's decision to vote no in the referendum. Complete independence from France." Charles felt his world shift beneath him. The referendum on the new French community had been designed to give African territories limited autonomy while maintaining French control. Guinea's rejection of this arrangement in favor of complete independence was sending shockwaves across French West Africa. "Who's speaking to them?" Charles asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Amadou Traoré," Keita confirmed quietly. Charles watched as Traoré stood in the center of the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. Even speaking in Bambara, his charisma was evident in the way students leaned forward, in Their enthusiastic responses in the way hope seemed to radiate outward from wherever he stood. "What is he telling them?" Charles asked. Keita hesitated. "He's explaining what independence means. He's telling them that they don't have to choose between being educated and being African. He's saying that the future belongs to them, not to us." Charles turned away from the window, his mind racing. The letter from Dakar suddenly made perfect sense. The colonial administration wasn't just restructuring. They were preparing for a fundamental change in how Africa would be governed and educated. Men like Charles, who represented the old system of unquestioned European authority, were being quietly pushed aside to make room for something new. "Monsieur Keita," Charles said slowly, "do you believe what he's telling those students?" The older teacher met his eyes directly. "I believe change is coming whether we're ready for it or not, sir. The question is whether we help guide that change or get swept away by it." Charles walked to his filing cabinet and pulled out his personnel files. Traoré's folder was thin but impressive. Top grades at teacher training college, glowing recommendations from his instructors, evidence of natural leadership and deep intelligence. In different circumstances, Charles realized he might have seen this young man as his protégé, someone to mentor and guide into administrative positions. Instead, they had become adversaries in a conflict neither of them had fully chosen. "What would you advise me to do?" Charles asked, surprising himself with the question. Keita considered this carefully. Perhaps it's time to ask what Amadou is really fighting for. Is he fighting against French education? Or is he fighting for the right of African children to see themselves as capable of greatness? That afternoon, Charles made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Instead of calling Traoré to his office for another confrontation, he walked to the young teacher's classroom after school ended. He found Traoré grading papers, working by the light streaming through the window. "Monsieur Traoré," Charles said from the doorway. "May I speak with you?" Traoré looked up, wariness flickering across his features. "Of course, sir." Charles entered the classroom and sat in one of the student chairs, a gesture that seemed to surprise both of them. "I received a letter today," Charles began. "I'm being reassigned. You'll have a new supervisor in 6 weeks." Traoré set down his pen, his expression unreadable. "I see. Before I leave," Charles continued, "I want to understand something. What exactly are you trying to achieve here? What is your vision for these students?" For the first time since they'd met, Traoré smiled. Not the polite professional smile he usually wore, but something genuine and warm. "I want them to know," he said simply, "that they are the inheritors of greatness." The conversation that followed would replay in Charles's mind for years afterward. Sitting in that classroom as the afternoon light faded, listening to Amadou Traoré speak about education, about dignity, about the future he envisioned for his students, Charles felt the foundations of his worldview shifting in ways he couldn't control. "When I was a boy," Traoré said, his voice taking on a storytelling cadence, "my grandfather told me stories about the great scholars of Timbuktu. He described libraries filled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, universities that attracted students from across the known world. I thought these were fairy tales, myths created to make us feel better about our circumstances." Charles found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. "Then I went to teacher training college in Dakar," Traoré continued. "My professors, French professors, taught us that African history began with colonization. Before that, they said there was only darkness, only primitive tribal existence. I accepted this because these were educated men with degrees from Paris universities. They must know the truth." "But they were telling you the truth," Charles interjected, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. "The achievements of a few isolated centers don't represent the broader reality of pre-colonial Africa." Traoré smiled sadly. "That's what I told myself too. Until I met Professor Diop in Dakar, a Senegalese historian who had studied at the Sorbonne. He showed me documents, archaeological evidence, accounts by Arab travelers from the medieval period. The stories my grandfather told weren't myths, Supervisor Dubois. They were history. Real, documented, undeniable history. Charles felt a familiar resistance rising in his chest. This was exactly the kind of romantic nationalism that threatened the careful order of colonial education. But something in Traoré's voice, some quality of passionate conviction tempered by scholarly precision, made it difficult to dismiss his words outright. Even if some of these claims are accurate, Charles said, what relevance do they have to preparing students for the modern world? We must deal with current realities, not past glories. But that's exactly my point, Traoré replied, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. When you teach a child that his ancestors were ignorant, that his culture is primitive, that intelligence and achievement belong only to Europeans, you destroy his ability to imagine himself as capable of greatness. You create what the psychologists call learned helplessness. Charles had never heard the term before, but its implications sent an uncomfortable chill through him. These children need to adapt to European standards if they want to succeed in the modern economy. Why can't they do both? Traoré asked. Why can't they learn mathematics and science and literature, while also understanding that they come from peoples who mastered these subjects centuries before Europe emerged from its own dark ages? Why must intellectual achievement require cultural suicide? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge Charles couldn't ignore. He thought about his own education, his pride in French civilization, his sense of inheriting a great tradition of learning and achievement. Had he ever been asked to abandon that heritage in order to master new subjects? You're asking me to accept that everything I've worked for, everything the colonial system has built is fundamentally wrong, Charles said quietly. No, Traoré replied. I'm asking you to consider that it might be fundamentally incomplete. Outside, the evening call to prayer drifted across the city, a haunting melody that spoke of traditions stretching back centuries. Charles had heard this sound thousands of times during his years in Africa, had always regarded it as picturesque background noise, exotic, but ultimately irrelevant to the serious business of modernization. Now listening to it in this new context, he wondered what stories it might carry, what wisdom he had never bothered to explore. Tell me about your grandfather, Charles found himself saying. Traoré's expression softened. He was a traditional healer, what you would call a witch doctor, but he was also a mathematician, though he never learned European notation. He could calculate complex astronomical movements, predict weather patterns, solve engineering problems related to irrigation and construction. His knowledge came from centuries of accumulated wisdom passed down through oral tradition. But surely formal education, systematic methodology, scientific verification, these represent improvements over traditional knowledge systems. Of course, Traoré agreed readily. But why must it be either or? Why can't we combine the best of both approaches? My grandfather's knowledge was empirical, based on careful observation and testing over generations. It simply wasn't written down in European languages or presented in European formats. Charles rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. This conversation was challenging assumptions he had never questioned, forcing him to examine beliefs that had shaped his entire adult life. What happened to your grandfather? He asked. Traoré's expression grew sad. He died last year. He spent his final years watching young people like me go away to European schools and return with contempt for everything he represented. He saw his own grandchildren ashamed of the knowledge that had sustained our family for centuries. The pain in the young teacher's voice was unmistakable, and Charles felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. He thought about his own grandfather, a professor at the University of Lyon, and how proud Charles had always been to follow in his intellectual footsteps. Is that why you became a teacher? Charles asked. To preserve his memory. Partly, Traoré replied. But mostly because I realized that education should expand possibilities, not limit them. When we teach children that they must choose between being African and being intelligent, between honoring their heritage and participating in the modern world, we impoverish everyone. As if summoned by their conversation, voices began to drift in from the courtyard. students who had returned to school for evening study sessions. Charles could hear them discussing their lessons in animated tones, switching fluidly between French and Bambara as they worked through mathematical problems and scientific concepts. "Listen to them," Traoré said softly. "They're using both languages, both ways of thinking. They're proving that integration is possible." Charles stood and walked to the window. In the gathering darkness, he could see clusters of students bent over their books, helping each other understand complex concepts. Their enthusiasm was evident even from a distance, a stark contrast to the mechanical recitation he remembered from his own traditional French classrooms. "If I were to stay," Charles said without turning around, "if I were to try to understand your approach better, what would you need from me?" The question surprised him as much as it clearly surprised Traoré. He hadn't planned to ask it, hadn't consciously decided to reconsider his position, but something about this conversation had opened a possibility he had never imagined before. "Respect," Traoré replied simply. "Not agreement necessarily, but respect for the idea that African students deserve to see themselves reflected in their education, deserve to build upon their own cultural foundations rather than being required to abandon them." Charles turned back from the window, studying the young teacher's face in the dim light. "And what would you need to give me in return?" "Patience," Traoré said with a slight smile, "and recognition that your dedication to these students, your desire to prepare them for success in the wider world, is genuine and valuable, even if we disagree about methods." For the first time since their initial confrontation, Charles felt something shift in his perception of their relationship. Perhaps they weren't inevitable enemies after all. Perhaps there was another way forward, one that honored both of their commitments to the students they served. The next morning brought news that would transform everything. A messenger arrived from Dakar with an urgent telegram that sent shockwaves through the school and the entire district. Mali had voted for immediate independence from France following Guinea's bold example. The French Community Agreement had been rejected, and within months Mali would be governing itself. Charles sat in his office, staring at the telegram in his hands, trying to process the implications. Everything he had built his career upon, the colonial education system, French administrative structures, the entire framework of European guidance for African development, was about to disappear. Not in some distant future, but within months. A crowd was gathering in the school courtyard again. Charles could hear excited voices speaking in multiple languages, could sense the electricity of momentous change crackling through the air. He walked to his window and saw Amadou Traoré once again at the center of the crowd. But this time he wasn't alone. Monsieur Keita stood beside him, along with several other senior teachers. Even some of the French administrative staff had joined the group, but what struck Charles most was the tone of the gathering. Instead of the revolutionary fervor he might have expected, there was something more complex happening: excitement, mixed with uncertainty, hope tempered by practical concerns about the future. Charles made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He left his office and walked directly into the crowd. The conversations quieted as he approached, but they didn't stop entirely. Students and teachers made space for him respectfully, but without the automatic deference he had grown accustomed to. He was no longer the unquestionable authority figure. He was simply another person trying to understand what the changes would mean. "Supervisor Dubois," Traoré said, his tone carefully neutral. "I assume you've heard the news?" "Yes," Charles replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I imagine this changes many things." An older student, one Charles recognized as particularly bright, spoke up in accented but clear French. "Sir, what will happen to the school? Will we still be able to take our examinations? Will our certificates still be valid?" It was exactly the kind of practical question that cut through political rhetoric to reach the heart of what really mattered: the futures of individual students who had worked hard and deserved clear paths forward. Charles looked around the crowd, seeing familiar faces that had become part of his daily life over the past several years. These weren't abstract political symbols. They were young people he had watched grow and develop, teachers he had worked with, families who had trusted the education system he represented. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty surprising everyone, including himself. Everything is changing so quickly. The examination systems, the curriculum standards, the administrative structures, all of it will need to be redesigned for an independent Mali. But surely, Monsieur Keita interjected, the knowledge remains the same? Mathematics doesn't change? Because of politics. Science doesn't become different because we have a new flag. Exactly, Traoré added, his eyes meeting Charles's directly. The real question is whether we can create an education system that serves Malian students without abandoning academic excellence. Charles felt the weight of the moment settling on him. Here was his opportunity to choose. He could retreat into defensive colonial attitudes, could resist the changes that were coming whether he liked them or not, or he could find a way to contribute constructively to whatever came next. Monsieur Traoré, he said slowly, aware that everyone was listening intently, you've spoken often about combining different approaches to education. If you were designing a curriculum for independent Mali, what would it look like? The question sent ripples of surprise through the crowd. This was not the confrontational supervisor they had grown accustomed to. This was someone genuinely seeking information. Traoré considered the question carefully before responding. I would start with the assumption that our students are capable of mastering any subject at the highest levels. But I would teach these subjects in ways that connect to their lives, their histories, their future roles as Malian citizens. Can you give me a specific example? Charles pressed. History class, Traoré replied without hesitation. Instead of memorizing French kings and European wars, students would learn African history, world history, and yes, European history too. They would understand how their own societies developed, how they interacted with other civilizations, how they were affected by colonialism, and how they can contribute to the modern world. A French administrative assistant, Mademoiselle Bertrand, spoke up nervously. But what about standards? How would you ensure that students receive education comparable to what they could get in France? Why should French standards be the measure? Traoré asked gently. Why not create Malian standards that are equally rigorous but more relevant to Malian realities? Charles found himself nodding slowly. The logic was undeniable, even if it challenged everything he had been trained to believe. About colonial education? What about practical matters? Charles asked. Textbooks, examinations, teacher training. All of these systems are currently based on French models. How would you transition without losing quality? For the first time since Charles had known him, Traoré looked uncertain. I don't have a